So by way of concluding, last night I was thinking about, obviously not knowing what the content of the day would include. I wanted to, again, leave the conclusion relatively free form, and what we've left on the table for discussion, and it seems like a really, really important discussion, is the question of what it is that is the objective, right? What it is that is the ideal. If communities are going to be involved, if more power is going to be devolved to communities in the ex ante moment for purposes of a more fair engagement, more fair relationship between communities and natural resource extraction companies, what is it that we mean by that? That's a very high level of abstraction to simply say that we're looking for engagement. The question is, what is the engagement for? To say that we're looking for something that's more fair, that fairness is itself super abstract. And so it would be really, I think, helpful and interesting to each of us to have something of a discussion of what it is that the objective is. And when I was looking through this is Paul Collier's most recent book called The Plundered Planet, and he has this nice, in the second chapter, he has this nice formula, which he says is a rather simple formula, which is nature plus technology minus regulation equals plunder. So nature plus technology, right, minus regulation equals plunder. And the factors that seemed to me relatively clear to fill in and know what they were was the nature and the technology, right? The knowledge, we know more or less what nature is and what its contents are, at least the limits of our scientific knowledge, we know that. And in the context of this discussion, we know what we mean by technology, the technology that makes large-scale mining operations of various kinds possible. The factor that I don't know the content of, even at the end of this discussion, is when we're talking about regulation, what do we mean? What are the purposes of regulation? What is it that would be helpful to communities in that, to fill in that piece of regulation? What would be helpful to communities in order to avoid plunder? So if we're going to have regulation, what should be the contents of that regulation? What are the objectives of that regulation? One of the ways to ask what the contents should be is to ask what the objectives should be. And again, hearkening to Stuart's paper about implicitly harmful industries, mining is an implicitly harmful industry. There are very few examples of this idea of sustainable mining is as you say, an oxymoron. And so that question is a really important question: is how do you deal with an implicitly harmful activity and try to give it try to give communities some traction on regulation that would make the activity less harmful to them at an ex ante moment. So I wanted to start with that, just with that question: what is the ideal? Who should be protected? Who is protected? Who's not? And what should be the contents of the regulation that would protect them?
Just throwing a very, very quick comment to that, which is something that I'd asked you earlier. It seems that we've concentrated a lot today on talk about indigenous groups, and I don't know if that's because the law around this is entirely addressing indigenous groups and their rights versus the peasants that Christy had referred to in the opening, or when I think about Burma, the collective national, the people versus their government. So I don't know if there are other ways of thinking about who needs to be addressed and what's left out of the sort of legal equation.
Yeah, it's definitely a very important question, and it's basically we've been talking mostly about indigenous peoples because they enjoy the strongest rights in terms of these types of rights, and compared to other groups of peoples for good reasons. But there's also, we can include Afro-descendants who live in tribal communities. All kind of tribal communities should be enjoying these rights as well. We discussed that a little bit this morning, but I think the bigger issue is what do you do with communities and people that don't fall into that rubric and don't enjoy those kind of rights. We talked a little bit earlier about whether or not consultation was enough, whether it means anything without consent, whether it means anything without other protections. And I think despite all the critique we can do about just the basic consultation concept and the rights, it's still really powerful. It's really powerful for mobilizing communities. It's really powerful for actually allowing communities to participate and people to participate in these processes. And it's powerful in getting a point in projects where you can actually successfully mobilize support or mobilize opposition to a project. And I think that's really, really key, even though it's not, even if it doesn't ever get to the veto stage, or even if it's not really fully implemented, just the amount of gains that we've had with consultation is really important. And as a really good example of how that is important, you can talk to communities that had to face the exact same kind of projects that aren't identified as indigenous communities and don't have these rights. And it's kind of, they look around and say, well, what kind of legal protections do we have? Well, not that many. I wish you talk to people like, oh, I wish we were an indigenous community, but we're not. We don't have consultations. We just don't have any options in this case. And that's sometimes like the bleak disparity of being faced in those situations is really apparent. And one of the things I think we should also talk about is what do we do with communities that don't enjoy those rights? Is there something that we can help to try to advance, to try to get this idea of maybe there's other forms of consultation, there's other forms of political participation that can be brought up and that could be framed also in the context of rights. Maybe there's something that should escape the framework of human rights, or framework of rights, or framework of law altogether that might be more effective. One of the things we're trying to do actually is promote ideas of the right to public participation and to frame that in a way that's similar to the consultation procedures, but more done under the lines of a public participation system that's already embedded in certain environmental legislation in different countries. The idea that there is some kind of right that people have to be consulted and to participate in these processes. Because even though there's no jurisprudence on the right to public participation of non-indigenous or non-tribal communities in development projects, even though there's no cases where there's a court or there's an international human rights body recognizing this, there are rights that can be interpreted as the right to public participation. If you look at the American Convention of Human Rights, there's a right in an article, don't quote me on my 25, talks about public participation. There's a similar right in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that talks about public participation. If you look at any document, any international instrument, declaration that talks about the values of democracy, they always start with public participation. So it's out there, and legally you can easily interpret these norms that are already out there and to say that there is some kind of right to public participation, that people need to be consulted or need to have the ability to participate in certain decisions that are made by their government, especially if they have large development projects that are just naturally have disaster or serious consequences towards communities. And this is kind of one of the concepts we're trying to advance. It's hard right now because consultation for indigenous people is very is politically sensitive, and there's a lot of backlash against it, as we talked earlier. But I think legally there's a basis for it, and it could actually help people people get more the opportunity at least to voice their opinion, the opportunity at least to mobilize some more opposition to certain of these projects. That could be very helpful.
If we look at the consulta process that we were talking about earlier in Guatemala, the first real consulta process was in Peru, and it wasn't an indigenous community. It was a mestizo community. It wasn't even a historically long-standing community, but it was people who were brought in with the World Bank in Campo Grande, people who were brought in with a World Bank irrigation project. And there was a gold mine. Manhattan Corporation was going to put in a gold mine, and they said it'll take away the water, and it'll also potentially affect our livelihood as agriculturalists, growing mangoes and growing limes and lemons and avocados. And they organized a community consultation or referendum on the mining project, and then that jumped over in Guatemala and became a very active tool for indigenous communities. But there's really no reason to use participatory democracy as a tool for all kinds of communities, regardless of their background or even how long they've been there. But I also wanted to mention that, we've been talking a lot about ground-up kinds of mechanisms, but we do need to think also about top-down mechanisms that might make those ground-up mechanisms work a little bit easier. And obviously a goal, like an end point, is to raise sort of international standards across the board for the mining industry. In the mining industry, there's actually rumors circulating that some of the biggest mining companies, say, I think the top 7 or 8 probably control, a very high percentage of the industry. And there's rumors that they might consent to a kind of regulatory framework. Now, every time you get them really close to sitting down, they run away, But that kind of notion that we could accept some basic kind of rules, don't dump into rivers, so no riverine tailings disposal, don't dump into oceans, that's a starting point. Rules about cyanide use, so you could start to think about some top-down regulations that if the largest mining companies in the world agree that it's in their best interests, that might help. They're always worried about the free riders, right? The smaller, more independent companies that won't obey the regulations, therefore produce at a lower cost, then you have a global downturn, and they're the only ones left operating, right? Because they're the only ones who can make a profit. So you need to address the free rider problem, I think, in order to get the big corporations to sign on to some kind of basic standards. So I think we need to work both from the bottom up, the ground up, and from the top down.
So I want to piggyback on this, though, that I think that the regulations that are needed to avoid plunder are not just going to focus on industry or specific industries in particular, but we should also think about kind of broader structural types of issues. So instead of thinking about civil and political rights, really think about social rights and the kinds of regulation of markets to try to kind of ensure some level of employment or economic security or income or basic education or health, so that people actually can participate in consultation, so that people actually as workers have choices. So thinking of the people that are mining the tin in Eastern DRC, so that they have more autonomy from the grassroots and at all levels. So I would say that we need to think of regulation not just kind of sectorally, but we also kind of, and maybe that's pie in the sky, but I just want to put it out there.
Leonardo, then Duffy. Or sorry, Mika. Leonardo, then Mika.
2 points to make. One about protections for those non-indigenous communities, and the second one about protecting indigenous communities. The first one, I think that there is a very good development in the private sector that should be more seriously addressed as a matter of policy and regulations in countries. I want to highlight one is the John Ruggie, Special Representative of the UN on Business and Human Rights, and that framework for the private sector in dealing with human rights, because we're talking about corporations promoting infrastructure, energy, extractive industry projects in developing countries, which is key, because human rights aren't merely individual rights. So the right to life, the right to participate in decision-making processes, the right to health, the right to benefit, the right to property are this set of rights that can be addressed, for example, in a human rights impact assessment. That's one I think is key. What you were saying about public participation, it's true. I have a case in Guatemala, and even non-indigenous communities were not even access to the information related to the environmental impact assessment that the mining company filed with the government. And they didn't get any information. They were not allowed to participate, despite the fact that there is an environmental regulation that asks the government to open the EIA for public comments within the public participation period. So that is another opportunity, and it is open for indigenous and non-indigenous communities, whoever is going to be affected by a project. Now, for indigenous communities, I disagree with the fact that the best strategy to protect those communities is free, prior, and informed consent. Simply because I have to think about what the communities need and what the leaders are requesting for. In the end of the day, they don't want to have a procedure. They don't know about that. What they want to have is a protection of their land. They want to keep having access to sacred sites in different areas of their territory. They want to keep controlling the natural resources in their territory without having different areas where they are not allowed to get in. Like, if you think about protected areas in indigenous land, that's one concrete example of how there is a conflict of environmentalist and indigenous interest in that area. That's one. The other one is that when I have to realize what is the best strategy to protect indigenous communities, I think about two legal rights. One is collective property rights to land and natural resources, and two, self-government rights, so that they can participate in decision makings according to their customs, and their legitimate representatives are the ones who are going to be making the decisions. That is key for a self-government argument, and that is key to empower the community in decision-making processes. Now, in terms of how I'm going to do that, in Guatemala, for example, I sued the state because the community self-government rights were not respected when the government was processing the EIS submitted by the mining company. No information, no participation in decision making. As a result, the EIA was approved, and afterwards the mine ministry issued this exploration permit without any knowledge and any participation of the community. That is clearly a violation of the right to the community to participate in the decision making processes regarding both the environmental impact assessment and the granting of the exploration permit for the mining company. Of course, the issue of property rights is another one, but I agree with him that public participation is something that we should pay serious attention to, especially for those communities who are not indigenous, and even for individuals. You can see, for example, in this pulp mills case in Argentina, where there is a dispute between two states, Uruguay and Argentina, before the ICJ, International Court of Justice. None of the people engaged are indigenous, and even the states are litigating about what are the consequences of that. And it's an issue of public participation as well. And it's a good example of how sometimes even states try to protect rights, and they take that seriously to the point that they sue another state before an international tribunal. So I just wanted to say that.
I agree with what Leonardo is saying about how, maybe perhaps we should think about frameworks that could be more useful than just consent, for example, the actual substantive rights. Though I think that there is still value, even if we look at consent or consultation as more of a procedural mechanism. I think that there is still value in upholding it, and from the conversations that you would have with at least Afro-descendant and indigenous communities in Colombia, you see that very much. the question of what purpose it serves, what is the objective, I think I would hesitate to try to define it too much, because I think at the end of the day, whether it's mobilization that they're going for, whether it's an opportunity to make some other issues or grievances more visible, whether it's an opportunity to really participate, reivindicate autonomy, to push towards self-governance, to push towards self-determination, whatever the goal might be. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to depend so much on the specific community. And I think that's part of the reason why when we talk about, consultation and consent, not to get too, meta, but the actual procedure for itself, should actually be determined by the community that's going to undergo it. So if it takes 8 meetings, if it takes 3 months, if it takes whatever, a certain amount of resources, we want our own experts, whatever that is something that the community really should define. And I think also, maybe thinking along those lines for a future seminar, for a future workshop, it would be useful maybe to bring in some of the voices, of these people who have been affected by project. I'm sure we're all very capable. We have a lot of experience between all of us combined. But I think maybe that is something that's missing here that could be useful to highlight in a future opportunity.
Yeah, I think that is a terrific suggestion, and one that even before this workshop happened, one that we sort of had in mind. So I want to say I absolutely ratify that idea, and it resonates very much with the suggestion of or with the proposal, right, or the design idea of bringing people together, right, who can share information about not just what has happened historically, but also what challenges are they facing today, and what are the methods that the companies are using. These are multinational corporations. They have multiple operation sites. It may be that it's useful for people who are facing an extraction activity from the same company to come together to talk about the strategies that the company is deploying in each of those locations, right? So I think that that's a fabulous idea, and it's a really good place, I think, for us to wrap up. 2 things. One, it seems really clear that this group of people could continue to talk, and hopefully will continue to talk after today. We'll be you have each other's email addresses already in the emails that Jonathan has sent, but we'll also send contact lists with emails specifically, so you can continue to be in touch with each other in conversation. But just by way of wrapping up, because we actually do have to do that, during the course of the day, there have been a lot of strategies put on the table, a lot of tools put on the table that would be useful to communities that are facing resource extraction activities, right? And the list of them is longer than I'll make now, but we started with talking about technology. Talking about information sharing was certainly very important. In the last session, we talked about the possibility, or the potential of innovative strategies like union organizing, right? Combining long-standing union activity together with human rights and environmental protection, and using the labor force, or thinking about ways to inform the labor force itself about the mechanisms that might be in place to protect their own community. They may very well, at the outset, look like they're contrary to their economic objectives, but may have much longer-term beneficial objectives without necessarily undercutting their economic objectives. And clearly, right, for all of us who have been here today, the question of additional research activity, both for purposes of simply understanding the problem, because it's so large but also so diverse, but also for purposes of practical assistance to communities, is really important. I think every one of us at the table here has a foot in practical work, as well as a foot in thinking about that practical work, and so that seems absolutely key. What I sort of find myself doing and thinking about concluding, because it's never easy to take a day like today and try to sum it up in some small paragraph, and so to some extent, I'd like to leave that to you in the summary papers that you submit. But it does occur to me that whether we're talking about free prior informed consultation, free prior informed consent, whether we're talking about any of the other strategies that we just suggested, that the ultimate objective, right, whether we're thinking about it, and I think we've all agreed that in all of these conversations, the move towards collective conceptions of rights is fundamentally key. Even if, whether we're talking about indigenous populations or not, the community that I started the day talking about would not define itself as an indigenous community, and yet they as a community are facing the very similar problems. The way that their community, their small community, will be affected is a community problem, and the community is ultimately going to have a strategy to engage with the company that's there. It's striking to me that there are sort of classically liberal ideas that are contradicted by the idea of community as opposed to the individual, and so there's a move away from sort of classic liberal philosophy and moving towards the collective, right? Moving away from the classic human rights framework towards an individual-based framework, towards a collective framework that's absolutely clearly important in this context. At the same time, it does seem like there are pieces that are important to retain at a really sort of theoretical level because of the project at hand, and one that doesn't seem to be at all contradicted by the conversation here today. And what I'm thinking about here is ultimately the question of will, right? Ultimately, what it seems to me we've all been thinking about during the day is how we, in one step of removal, or 2 or 3 or 4 steps of removal from the communities that are actually going to be affected by these, mining operations, what we can do to assist, right, to aid in the exercise of free will. I think Yuki and I absolutely agree with you that the precise dimensions of what a community might want at any given moment, that we can't define. It would be impossible to define it. So I've been trying to think, what is the first level of abstraction with which I feel comfortable? And I think, for me anyway, the first level of abstraction with which I feel comfortable is in assuring that a community is able to assess what would be best for it, right? And then through that assessment, exercising its will in order to obtain the objectives that it is designed for its own self. Now, of course, that will, in the example that I started out with, and the first thing we talked about was that there's always going to be a multi-textural problem, right? That there are multiple communities that are affected by these large extraction activities or by large infrastructure projects, and to assume that one community's will is reflective of another community's will is immediately and implicitly problematic. But I think ultimately the question of, for me anyway, the day leaves me thinking more about the question of will than I had thought it would, given the questions that we have on the table. I want to really thank each of you for your contributions during the day. It's fun to bring together a group of people that I think will learn from each other, and it's really fun to bring here a group of people that I knew that I would learn from, and I learned from you more than I anticipated, and that's always just such a pleasure, such a joy. It makes me so happy for the opportunity. So thanks for coming. I hope you get out on the streets of Bloomington tonight, because it'll be fun, and let's just be in touch, and we'll definitely be in touch about the papers, and then you can just read each other's contributions. Thanks so much.